Hattusa was not built like a city waiting to be admired. It was built like a warning. High on the Anatolian plateau, surrounded by cliffs, stone walls, gates, and cold winds, the Hittite capital looked less like a place humans had settled and more like a fortress carved out of the earth itself. And that is what makes Hattusa so strange. This was not a city on an easy river plain, not a glittering port, not a soft capital resting beside the sea. It stood inland, in a rugged landscape where stone dominated everything. Yet from this remote place, the Hittites ruled one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age and challenged the strongest kingdoms of their world. This is Empires Lost in Time, and today we are entering Hattusa, the rock city of the Hittites. If you enjoy cinematic journeys through forgotten empires, ancient ruins, and cities that still feel alive beneath the silence, subscribe to the channel. Because this story is not just about a lost capital. It is about a civilization that wrote its power into stone, clay, and mountain air. To understand Hattusa, you have to imagine the approach. The road climbs through central Anatolia. The land opens, then tightens again. Hills rise, rock formations appear, and then, slowly, the ruins begin to show themselves. Walls stretching across the landscape, gates guarded by carved animals, broken temples, buried archives, and the remains of a city that once spoke with the voice of an empire. The Hittites did something almost impossible here. They turned difficult geography into authority. Hattusa was not placed where it was because the land was comfortable. It was placed where the land could be controlled. The hills became defenses. The rocks became foundations. The walls became political theater. Every visitor approaching the city had to understand the same message. Power lives here. And at its height, Hattusa was not a small mountain stronghold. It was a royal capital with temples, palaces, administrative spaces, storage areas, and fortifications stretching for kilometers. The city was organized, planned, and protected. It was a machine of government built in stone, where kings, scribes, priests, soldiers, craftsmen, and servants all moved inside the logic of imperial power. Now, the first image most people remember from Hattusa is the Lion Gate. Two stone lions stand at the entrance like guardians from another age, weathered but still watching. They are not realistic in a modern sense, and that is exactly why they work. They feel symbolic, protective, ancient, like they were placed there to tell anyone entering the city that this was not an ordinary threshold. But the Lion Gate was only one piece of the larger message. Hattusa also had the Royal Gate, the Sphinx Gate, massive walls, tunnels, ramps, and monumental approaches that turned movement through the city into an experience. You did not just walk into Hattusa, you were processed by it. The city made you feel small before you ever reached the king. And here is the part that matters. Hattusa was not only built for defense, it was built for memory. Inside the city, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets were preserved in archives. They carried laws, treaties, rituals, letters, myths, prayers, instructions, and records of a world that would have almost completely vanished without them. The Hittites did not leave us only ruins, they left us their voice. Think about that for a second. A city made of stone gave us a civilization through clay. The walls tell us about fear and power, but the tablets tell us about thought. They reveal kings negotiating, priests performing rituals, officials managing resources, and scribes copying words in languages from across the ancient Near East. Hattusa was not isolated from the world. It was connected to it through writing. That is why the Hittites are so fascinating. For a long time, they were half hidden in history, known through fragments, names, and references from other ancient peoples. Then archaeology began to open Hattusa, and the tablets changed everything. The lost empire became readable. The city that had collapsed into silence began to speak again, not with one text, but with an entire archive. And what it said was extraordinary. Hattusa was the capital of a power that dealt with Egypt, Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and smaller kingdoms caught between giants. The Hittites fought, negotiated, absorbed, threatened, married, traded, and made treaties. They were not a footnote to Egypt or Babylon. They were one of the major forces shaping the political world of the late Bronze Age. The great rival everyone remembers is Egypt. The Battle of Kadesh, fought between the Hittites and the Egyptians under Ramses II, became one of the most famous military clashes of the ancient world. And years later, the two powers reached a peace agreement that has become one of the most celebrated diplomatic documents in history. That is the scale we are talking about. Hattusa was not ruling a forgotten corner. It was speaking to pharaohs. If this story is pulling you in, leave a like and subscribe to Empires Lost in Time. These lost cities matter because they remind us that history is not only built by the places everyone remembers. Sometimes, the center of the world is hidden in the mountains. But Hattusa was also a sacred city. The Hittites are famous for what later scholars call the 1,000 gods of their world, because their religion absorbed and preserved deities from different peoples, regions, and traditions. And near the capital, at Yazilikaya, the rock sanctuary turns faith into landscape. Gods and goddesses are carved into stone chambers, as if the divine world had stepped directly out of the mountain. That image tells you something deep about Hattusa. This was a city where politics, religion, and stone were inseparable. The king did not rule only through armies. He ruled through ritual, ceremony, divine legitimacy, archives, treaties, and walls. The city was not just the seat of government. It was the place where the empire explained itself to gods and men. And yet, for all that power, Hattusa always carried a kind of tension. It was magnificent, but remote. Strong, but exposed. Sacred, but dependent on systems that had to keep functioning across huge distances. Grain had to move. Armies had to obey. Vassals had to stay loyal. Borders had to be defended. Rituals had to be performed. Messages had to travel. The capital looked eternal, but the empire around it was fragile. The Hittite world had enemies and pressures from many directions. There were conflicts in Syria, rival powers abroad, unrest and threats closer to Anatolia, and groups on the edges of the empire who could not simply be erased. Like every Bronze Age superpower, the Hittites lived inside a network. And when that network began to fail, even a city made of stone could not save itself. Around 1200 BC, the ancient Eastern Mediterranean entered a period of collapse and transformation. Palaces fell, trade routes broke, kingdoms weakened or disappeared. The exact causes are still debated, and that matters because history is rarely honest when it gives us one clean villain. It was probably not one thing. It was pressure stacked on pressure until the system could no longer breathe. And then Hattusa was abandoned and destroyed. But even here, the story refuses to be simple. Archaeology suggests that parts of the city may have been emptied before the final destruction. Valuables were removed from some spaces. The end may not have been a single surprise attack against a thriving capital, but something more unsettling. A controlled withdrawal, a breakdown, and then fire. Imagine that. Not just an enemy at the gate, but a capital losing its function before the flames. Archives falling silent, courtyards emptying, temples stripped, officials gone, roads no longer carrying the same messages, the city still standing, but the imperial mind already fading. Hattusa did not only burn, it stopped being necessary to the world that had created it. And once that happens to a capital, stone becomes powerless. Walls can keep out armies, but they cannot hold an empire together when the empire has lost its center. Gates can intimidate visitors, but they cannot command loyalty from empty provinces. Archives can preserve laws, but they cannot force history to continue. Hattusa was built to endure, and still, it entered silence. For centuries, the ruins remained. Later peoples lived in the region, new powers rose, new languages spread, and the name of the Hittites slipped away from ordinary memory. The city that had once negotiated with Egypt and ruled across Anatolia became a landscape of broken stones, mysterious reliefs, and buried tablets waiting for someone to understand them again. That rediscovery is part of the magic of Hattusa. When modern explorers and archaeologists began studying the site, they were not simply uncovering walls. They were reopening a lost civilization. The tablets helped scholars identify the city, read the language, and reconstruct a world that had been almost erased. In a strange way, Hattusa survived because clay remembered what people forgot. So when you look at Hattusa today, do not imagine just ruins under the Turkish sun. Imagine a capital alive with movement, soldiers at the gates, priests walking toward sanctuaries, scribes pressing signs into wet clay, messengers arriving from Syria, diplomats carrying royal words, fires burning in temples, lions watching the road, and above all of it, the plateau wind moving through stone. That is the power of Hattusa. It feels severe. It feels distant. It feels almost impossible. And yet it was deeply human, because behind all those walls, there were people trying to do what every empire tries to do: control, fear, organize memory, speak to the gods, dominate rivals, and convince time that their world would not end. But time answered anyway. The empire fell. The capital burned. The language was forgotten. The gods lost their worshippers, and the city of rock became a city of questions. Who emptied its palaces? Who saw the last flames? Who closed the last archive? Who walked through the Lion Gate knowing that Hattusa would never be the same again? We may never know all of that, but we know enough to feel the weight of the place. Hattusa was one of the great capitals of the Bronze Age, a city where stone, writing, religion, and imperial ambition came together in one of history's most dramatic landscapes. It was not meant to disappear quietly, and maybe that is why its ruins still feel loud. If you want to continue this journey through lost cities, forgotten empires, and civilizations buried beneath time, watch the next documentary from Empires Lost in Time. Because Hattusa reminds us of something every ruin eventually teaches. Even the strongest walls are temporary, but the questions they leave behind can last for thousands of years.